Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for taking time out of your night to join Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association as we have our first town hall of 2021, specifically focused around the homelessness crisis in our city. The subtitle is How Do We Get Here? We may not be able to answer all of those questions tonight, but we are extremely grateful and excited to have two amazing panelists join us this evening who Grace will introduce. Part of tonight's evening will be a part of hearing from them, and then we will attempt to get to as many questions that some of you may have later on or at the halfway point of tonight's conversation. So without any further ado, I won't say any more, but I'm going to turn it over to Grace as she introduced our guests, and we'll be off to the races. Again, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tabitha. So we have two wonderful speakers here with us this evening. The first is Sheila Delaney. Sheila's served in a consulting capacity for a lot of different projects related to folks experiencing homelessness. A couple include scenarios like the Drake Hotel fire, as well as indoor villages and that project that's been happening in Minneapolis. And our second panelist is Dr. Zayed Ahmed, who is the, I'm going to say, director of programming. I hope that's correct. She nodded, but she'll correct me if I got that a little off, at Avenues, which is an organization that PPNA is a fan of, who works with youth experiencing homelessness in the Twin Cities. So with that, I will pass it off to Dr. Ahmed first to introduce herself and give a little background to her work.
Make sure I'm off mute. Thank you, Grace. And thank you everyone for having me today. This is an honor to be invited to really have a conversation with you about kind of what we're seeing happening in the Twin Cities around the experience of homelessness. So as Grace said, I am Dr. Zayed Ahmed, and I am the director of programs at Avenues for Youth. I've been with Avenues now for roughly about 8 years, and in that time, my work has really centered around kind of understanding the role that the experience of homelessness has in the well-being of how young people show up in the world. And so by profession, I'm a psychologist. And so my work has always centered around kind of the wellness of one's life experience. So I've really done a lot of work at Avenues around how the experience of homelessness is impacting our young people in the world. How are they ready to come into the world and be contributing members? Does the experience of homelessness cause additional mental health issues? Is it that young people are experiencing homelessness because they first came to having mental health issues, and so that caused some of the experiences? You know, for an example, families that felt unprepared to be able to support that young person in dealing with their mental health issues. In my time in the field, I have done extensive work around gender, around specifically culture has been my niche of work, but from juvenile justice system to gender responsiveness to education. I also teach part-time as a professor in psychology. And so my work is kind of not necessarily all over the place, but as to me, it all works together and flows together. But it has always really centered culture and our way of showing up in the world and our experiences because of the way our bodies show up in the world. And so my work then sometimes takes on a fold of trauma. It takes on a lens of the experience of homelessness, food instability, community instability, being uprooted and needing to reroot in community because of our life experiences. And I think my work as of recent at Avenues, even though it's always centered around the experience of homelessness, has really been kind of pushing a social justice practice and pushing our kind of work towards re-envisioning what it looks like to work together from a perspective of liberation within for each of us, and how is that tied together for all of us so that we make changes that feel transformative and that they stick. So I will stop there, but that's a little bit of my life. And I think I'm passing it to you, Sheila, but Grace, please interject if I should pass it.
You're right. It's more
okay. Okay.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Zayed, and thank you, Tabitha and Grace, for inviting me. I'm extremely honored to be asked by you two. I had the pleasure of getting to know you a little bit this summer over our work together in response to first the Midtown Sheraton Hotel and then the encampment crisis. As Tabitha reminded me today, some people on this call may have deep grounding in this work, and some people may be new to this and think that perhaps the wheels just fell off, but that's not at all the case. My work and my perspective is very much as a community advocate. Professionally, I've been a community organizer and events manager a lot of the time when people have paid me to do work. But my career began at St. Joseph's Home for Children. And so I was part of that very, very nonprofit paradigm in which people were served, and then there were people who received service. And I very quickly realized that was not the way that transformation happens. And from that point on, somewhat like Dr. Zayed says, my experience has been broad, that has always been around bringing people together. And I am an impatient person and have taken on a lot of project management roles. And I do have some slides to share that give you my specific perspective. I'm going to go through them very quickly. I'm going to share my screen right now. So my moral formation had an awful lot to do with being very much raised with an aunt who is a Franciscan. And for those of you who don't know, Franciscan sisters were very active in social justice, but especially their perspective was about solidarity versus service. And so that was what I learned from a very young age, was what we should strive to do with one another. And then especially that all of us have needs. It's not just people who are in a role that may need specific help. Sometimes I need help, sometimes you need help. The question of, despite the goals that we've had for systems have had for ending homelessness, we are not there yet. But I still have a tremendous amount of hope. Some of the things that primarily what gives me hope is the work we've all done together so far, and especially our commitment to understanding that our strength comes through solidarity with one another, and it actually doesn't come through systems. However, we can impact systems by coming together. Some of the things I'm really excited about locally are Envision Community. I've been assisting them as a volunteer there. It's a project led by people with lived experience. We see culturally specific projects emerging, the AICDC shelter, Homeward Bound. And also I'm excited to see that there's some innovation happening in the suburbs. One project among several is the Settled Tiny Home Community in Woodbury. There's a lot of hope internationally. I'm particularly excited about public housing in Europe. Many public housing projects are beautiful and are led by community members. Another thing I want to emphasize, and where I come from, organizing works, there's been some real success. And then also another huge element to what home is the concept that we are on stolen land, and land back has been either literally or figuratively directed toward addressing homelessness. And I found that very inspirational. To cover your question, how did we get here? We got here because we as a nation have not devoted the resources to accomplish the solutions of scale we need to meet the growing needs of our community. It's a failure of policy, but it's really, and I don't like to say, I don't think this lightly, it's our failure. And what I mean by that is that we can take action on these issues, but it has to start with our thinking. And I know that through, believe me, some serious trial and error on my part about my thinking and where my thinking needed to be corrected. But my aunt, Sister Joyce, had said, she was always ahead of her time. She died in 2017. If neighbors sleeping outdoors in freezing weather was disturbing to us as a dog in the same circumstance, we would not accept unsheltered homelessness, and we would not stop until it was ended. And that goes to the question of who deserves and who doesn't deserve. And also, particularly in Minnesota, and I'm sure I'm not as knowledgeable about the rest of the country, our sheltered neighbors are reflective of.
I'm so sorry, that was my fault, Sheila. My finger slipped, but can we unmute you?
That's fine. So my framework is about getting involved with one another, not charity, connecting with one another, then taking action. This year in particular, we have some opportunities, including if you're so moved to get involved in rent control. And especially this year with the local election, electing people who do have lived experience, who you trust are going to work with you as community and not for you. So that is it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ahmed and Sheila. Truly, well, Sheila, one, you went through that extremely quickly, like you said. So we appreciate that. Do you, I think you're still sharing your screen. So wonderful. So everyone, really at this point, we're just going to begin to kick off the questions with a few prepared. And when I say a few, just two, a few prepared questions that we have for our panelists. And then we will open it up to other questions that you have already begun to put into the chat. So just bear with us. And as Grace has already indicated, we will try to get to as many of our attendee questions as possible. So the first one, and Sheila began to touch on this a little bit, but it's for both of you. So knowing that Hennepin County led an effort to create a 10-year plan to end homelessness in 2006, why do you think we've still been unable to make significant progress in reducing the number of residents, the number of people who experience homelessness in our city? So Sheila, why don't we ask you to kick us off so maybe you can kind of continue the thread that you left, and then Dr. Ahmed, then we'll bring you into the conversation.
Thank you. Not to oversimplify, but I feel very strongly that the reason we have still not addressed this addressable issue is because it hasn't been important enough to us. And we have not held our elected officials, who are us, accountable to see this end. Now, there have been problems, right? There have been a recession in 2008. There's a pandemic. There's other circumstances and conditions. But the bottom line is, I like to remind myself, Sheila, you can do a lot when you want to, and government can do a lot when it wants to. And so it's a failure of imagination and commitment. And the reason I shared my aunt's quote with you, and it's very harsh, but she spent her life trying to fight for social justice, is for some reason, we are not moved in the same way as we are moved about some other issues to take action on this and to frankly insist that our public officials address the issues. There's a lot of details I could share about ways I've seen things work and projects I've worked on, but fundamentally, it's an us problem. It's because we haven't prioritized it.
Thank you, Sheila. Dr. Ahmed, what would you say? How would you respond to that question?
I think if I was really transparent, I would say that we haven't made more progress because of a lack of trust of the system itself. I think that when we look at our history with systems, specifically that we know that the largest number of individuals that are experiencing homelessness are BIPOC communities, people of color. And I think that what we understand is that those folks have been impacted by the system. I want to say the hardest at the largest numbers. And I think when you think about that and you think about, so of course, again, I'm coming from a youth lens because that's where my work lives right now. But when we think about the fact that the young people that I work with have been involved in the system, some of them since they were the age 5, or some of them from birth. We had a young person who talked about her parent experiencing homelessness, right? And now she is. And so when we talk about that, this engagement in the system has been lifelong, there's a distrust of that system and how can that system solve a problem for a community. But if I were to piggyback off of that, I would also say, I think that we haven't made more progress because we have not looked to the community for their own wisdom. I think we have for a long time been planning for community. And because there's a distrust of the system, even when that system invites people in to help them address the problem, there's still a distrust of the conversation that happens and who retains power of what happens in that community. So one of the projects we are working on at Avenues really looks at how we really bring community back in and how do we look to the ways things were done now. So as Sheila, as Tabitha, we've been talking about already, homelessness has existed for a very long time, probably longer than we know. I think it's a part of our history in this country because you have had folks who have experienced poverty since this country began. And because of that, homelessness has also been that issue. I think when we look at how communities used to address their experiences of homelessness, we have yet to even begin to tap into the wisdom that they employed to house themselves. We've relied on a system to create something for them rather than creating something for themselves. So as I've sat in meetings with communities of color, I've really listened to how funding is distributed. I've listened to who money has to come from, and I've listened to folks in communities of color talk often about being handed something versus being able to create something. And when one creates something and has ownership of that thing that they create, there's a buy-in that looks different than a system creating something and giving something to someone. So I think for me, in my lens, you know, I think that we will not solve the problem until we start to look at the wisdom that existed before now. And even though there was a problem then, you had more people who were able to help house each other from a standpoint of that no one had to live on the street than we have now. So our numbers in some ways keep going up because we have more rules that keep us from addressing our own issues. So I would stop there, but those are some of my thoughts.
Oh, that's wonderful. And this is a conversation. And so I'm just going to recite or repeat what I think I heard both of you say in terms of one of the solutions, because it leads into the next question, because we were going to ask you to provide 1 to 2 strategies that you both believe would make a significant difference, would move the needle, would help us as a collective community see different outcomes when it comes to our residents experiencing homelessness. And 2 that you both have shared. So for you, Dr. Ahmed, you mentioned the community wisdom, right, being part of the strategy. And then Sheila, you basically mentioned the lack of, or what is needed is system imagination. So I would just invite you both to either add or expound on a couple of the strategies that you've already laid out, and potentially add to that as well in terms of what are other things that you believe would be what I call mission critical to have in place in order for us to collectively as a community to see some different outcomes. And Dr. Ahmed, I would just toss it back to you, and then Sheila will have you come off of mute.
So I think if I were to continue to expand on my thought, I think one of the things that is happening, so I do want to give credit, is this year alone, 2021, the end of 2020, I saw more RFPs that were being put out to specifically target BIPOC leadership and communities to create their own vision of how they might end the experience of homelessness. When I saw the first RFP that said we are specifically looking for creative ideas on how communities of color might address, and they specifically targeted Black or African American communities and Indigenous communities, how they might address this experience. And the language that was used, one, I had to read it 2 or 3 times because I said, oh, people know this language. And to see it being used in a way that felt authentic, right, it was different. And I'm still sitting with, I want to say it was incredible, but I'm still sitting with, is this going to be real? So I think one strategy is what's happening, a movement that's starting to happen. And that is giving funding that doesn't have all the parameters around it, that keeps the, to use Sheila's word, the imagination from happening, that keeps the flow of people or the communities of color wisdom from creating what they envision to happen for themselves, right? So I think for me, one strategy is one, how we use money, how we understand community wealth, how we understand wealth building, how we understand kind of the creation of wealth in communities. So we talk about stealing land. I look a lot at the fact that we've stole the potential to create wealth in a community that then supports that community. So how do we put that back in the community? So again, the building is happening from within the community, which also shapes the plan, the thought process, the investment. And then I think for me, another strong strategy is how do we get, again, community buy-in so that they're sitting at the table, even without the county or the community folks, to plan, to make plans. because I often think, because there's a distrust, some of the things that don't get said and some of the things that don't get shared are astronomical, and they really create a detriment to what can happen. So sitting in 2019 with elders over and over and over again, one of the things that I constantly heard from those elders were that we need a healing in our communities, and that healing can't come from outside. It has to come from inside. Everyone has to know their part in changing occurrences and systems that create what is happening. And so when a community understands to some extent that they are the only way that these changes happen, that their buy-in, that them showing up, that they have to be a part of the solution, it changes the dynamic of who has power and who is the force behind the shift of change. So I have a lot more to say, but I will push it over to you, Sheila, as this is a conversation, just for us to keep talking more about it.
No, that was great. Dr. Ahmed, Sheila, before you jump in, just for those who may needed a reference, when Dr. Ahmed mentioned an RFP, that is an acronym for request for proposal that maybe some funders put out to provide grant dollars or some other type of contract to do certain types of work in community. So thank you, Dr. Ahmed.
Thanks, Tabitha.
You know.
Well, the only thing that I would add is that I listen with so much frustration when I hear Dr. Zayed talk about how communities of color and communities in need, people that have been disenfranchised, have to consistently wait for resources to be distributed to them, or commercial areas need to be reconstituted, when really communities throughout history, when given enough resources, they have the ability to take care for themselves. And so one of the things that in my journey from being a 20-year-old at St. Joseph's Home for Children, working at Catholic Charities, spending a lot of time with Drake residents who were displaced from the fire, spending a lot of time trying to figure out a viable winter solution for this winter. That was the Indoor Villages project that Grace mentioned. Now my focus is in my neighborhood, which is Loring Park. We have a tremendous amount of people in need, and not just in need materially, but they're very much, we are isolated, and we were isolated before the pandemic. And so I think that we have been led to believe that we can't do it on our own, that experts and government can tell us what to do. And the reason that it resonates so profoundly when Dr. Zayed talks about RFPs being specifically asking for people, what do you think, is because really that's how things work, and that's how it should be. And I also always think about, I have never heard a contradiction to this statement. I just recently heard it from the director of the national, national something of the homelessness. I'll make sure to share it with you. I have a resource list for people. Anytime people have given people who are unsheltered their own money, they know what to do with the money. And so all of these systems, we need them because this is the place we built. But I think by connecting with one another, by doing the really hard work of collaborating and creating together, we do better. And we have to face our biases and our differences, but ultimately we shouldn't have a situation where we have to beg for the resources that are right. And I hate to say capitalism, but I mean capitalism. We are now realizing that this system doesn't work that well. And I think that redistributing wealth is a very important factor in just getting people the resources they need to live the way they know they need to live. The other piece is the isolation piece and the lack of connection. What I've learned as I listen to providers and I listen to people who have lived the experience of unsheltered homelessness, that I went down to New Orleans and they have a low barrier shelter there, and it's not nearly as nice as some of our shelters here. But they told me what I've always heard is when housing placements fail, people come back to that shelter, which in my opinion, it's not comfortable. They come back because they need that connection. And in the words of the person who ran this shelter, she said, some of them might have hated me, but they miss me because I'm there for them. I am there. I have a relationship with them. And when people go off and get placed into housing, it's not enough. And so when I look at a program like Envision Communities, which places the priority on creating the community first, that gives me hope. But again, I just wish we weren't in a position where people have to scrounge for resources, because I do believe people know what they need.
Thank you, Sheila. And so I think you had just mentioned that you have a resource list that you'll be able to provide folks. I'm going to start with one question from community that kind of touches on that. And it reads as follows. As a white cisgendered homeowner in Powderhorn, I did some solidarity work this summer in the park and am now looking for ways to continue the solidarity work while understanding that I want to follow the lead of BIPOC leaders. Do you have suggestions for where to connect in an authentic way? And so that's for both of you. If there's some resources, whether or not you can speak to now or can provide that we can share with attendees later, that would be great. Sheila, do you want to start?
I would just reiterate to get connected to people who are in proximity to you and your sphere of influence. And if that means that you live in an all-white world, then find a way to be connected to people who aren't white. Beyond that, I would defer to Dr. Zayed.
I think, Sheila, I think you did answer that well. I think that oftentimes when one situation hits us, we get engaged with it, but we fail to look deeper at why the situation existed in the first place. And I think what homelessness pushes in each of us when we experience it or see the experience is it either creates a disconnect between that's not my problem, or it creates a connection between how have I been complicit in creating or furthering the problem. Either way, at some point, there's a disconnect between that I, as an individual, may have played some role in a system that has helped to create the issue. So I think why I would echo Sheila in some regards is that I think to really disenband or to address the system of the experience of homelessness, we as a community, and I'm saying all bodies, have to really sit and look at how have we been conditioned to say that our systems that are in place will take care of the problem. And then how have we then not stepped in and addressed how we have contributed to the actual problem. So I think learning from other people in your community, as Sheila said, if you are white body, really educating yourself on the ways that systems have empowered you and taken power away from others. I think all of those things have to happen. And my experience, at least at Avenues, is that while we focus on the experience of homelessness, we don't ever leave out the experience of racism, classism, poverty, equity. Like these things go hand in hand. So it's not just about the experience of homelessness or homelessness, it's about a larger system that perpetuates that experience and thus creates and gives life to these other isms, right? So they all kind of reside within each other. And so there are multiple ways to get engaged. But one, I think, is doing your own work. Two is seeking out organizations and supporting them, not just by financially, but physically, mentally, in ways that help you engage in community, help community reroute. But I agree with Sheila, in your own community is a great place to start because it's where you may have the greatest impact because you live within that community. So
that's really, excellent, because it goes into the next question. And it's really about building on, if you both can, to where you began to go, Dr. Ahmed, in terms of this is a bigger conversation than housing alone. So given the realities of a person's lived experience, how might community advocate for solutions that are more custom to the needs of residents experiencing homelessness, right? So if we're thinking about the realities of a person's life could include trauma, it could include substance abuse, it could include mental health needs. How do we as a community advocate for solutions that actually do a better job of meeting people in some ways where they're at, but actually deals with these other needs that sometimes complicates or makes housing stability more challenging? And I'm going to give Dr. Ahmed a break, and then we'll come to you, Sheila, as she's processing, and then we ask Dr. Ahmed to share her thoughts.
Well, there are so many ways you might go about doing it, and I certainly insisting that funding is tied to co-creation would be one policy move you could make. In the city of Denver, there is a levy for the prevention of homelessness. Now, they don't do this, but I would love to see something like that here, but have it be tied specifically to efforts that dismantle systemic racism and systemic disinvestment. I know that the director of at Hennepin, the Office to End Homelessness, David Hewitt, this summer, I'm aware that he took a couple of project requests to people who were experiencing homelessness at the time and had them act as their reviewers. I think that that's a step in the right direction, although I think there's a big gap there because there's an inherent imbalance of power. So I would like to see, in the same way, for example, if we have an issue that has to go through our planning commission at the city of Minneapolis is quasi-judicial. It has a lot of power. I would like to see people with lived experience of systemic racism and other conditions, not just homelessness, but mental health, chemical health conditions, be empowered to be relied upon to be the voices of what is a good move or not. Again, I think that ultimately, as you get active, and we live in a democracy and we have a local election, it's important to prioritize electing people with lived experience and those that are willing to commit to work with you as community. That's an aspect I think is important. But beyond that, as a white woman, I've had to learn my lessons of, again, harkening back to that time at St. Joe's to where I am now. Believe me, I'm still have a long way to go, but I have only see things work better when people who are impacted create the solutions. And I would just really encourage us to figure out how we could formalize that on a policy level.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sheila, for that. Dr. Ahmed, is there any other thoughts that you might share on that question before we move to the next?
Yeah, so I think I won't add much because I think Sheila touched upon a lot of things. I think what I would add from a more internal place, I'm always pushing people to do the internal work, is when we talk about individuals in our communities who have been impacted by multiple, again, I'm going to call them systems. So whether it's chemical dependency, mental health, poverty, I always say to individuals, to start to do that work, what does that experience of being with those people elicit in you? How are they a reflection of your own experiences? And what is your fear in regards to those conversations? So I think that the only thing I would add is that I definitely think that we need to figure out how we create more accessible things within those communities. So for an example, often a community might be hit with specific things, but there isn't resources within that community to address those specific issues. So a person has to leave that community to come back. And I think one of the other things that I've seen happen, specifically in the homeless world, if you will call it, is that folks are starting to say, how are each individual community being hit and what's needed in that community to support that community. So if you look at specific communities, there are times where you see trends within that community. So we've been talking about Powderhorn, throughout this meeting, and we know, for an example, I want to say last year, the year before, we had it's very similar to the encampment in that area. And so that then one has to stop and get to the source and say, why was that a trend? Why was that happening in that moment in that community? And what was needed in that community at that moment? And so I think where I'll stop is just saying that we have to really look at each community and understand who's present in that community and why are the trends present and what resources are missing in each individual community versus as a whole. So each community has its own kind of niche of people that live there, of circumstances that live there, and of needs. And we often, as a system, look at a whole. So we'll say the Twin Cities versus North versus Powderhorn versus this area. And I think each area has a set need of resource that we don't tap into to give kind of a building block or a sense of the community being able to reroute and readjust to why those needs are arising.
Thank you. So the next question from the community is, are there cities that do a better job in co-creating housing solutions with people experiencing homelessness? So are there cities that either of you are aware of that do a better job in co-creating housing solutions with people experiencing homelessness?
Okay, I'm gonna say without being asked, I actually don't necessarily want to put too much voice to that answer because similar to what I heard Sheila say, like my work has been global and I've gotten to sit with people actually internationally around the experience of homelessness and housing instability. But it's hard to give voice to like right now what's happening because COVID is happening. And I think that there are people who do different types of housing better. So what I mean by that is we're looking at this as one solution. And when we talk about housing, there are multiple models of how we address the experience of homelessness. And so we have to really look at the different models and say, and Sheila may have a totally different answer or a better answer to this, but we have to look at different models and say, what models work again best in this community? Because each model doesn't work well in every community. And it doesn't mean it's because that community does it better or not or worse. It really has a lot to do with the community itself and its way or its history of how it houses itself. So I know that was an answer that didn't go in depth, but what I've seen even in the Twin Cities is that we may not do this type of housing really well, but it's because of the need of that community in this area as to why, but it might thrive better in this community. And that is the same kind of pattern I see on a global and national level, that different models work differently in different places, some better, some worse, depending on the population, the ethnicity, the culture, etc., will contribute to how models work. So I can't give a specific area, but I can say in my studies that, for an example, if I look at the UK, they've done host home models really well. But that to me would exemplify kind of the population that lives there and why that works there. Versus here, we might see that rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing works really well. So one is not working better than the other. They're different models and different approaches.
We as a community appreciate your qualifier on your response, but I just want to encourage our panelists that I am confident that our community really appreciates the lens by which you answer the question. So you do not have to indicate, in my opinion, that it's not exactly what we were looking for. I think that that was a great answer. I mean, even if it did not provide a particular locale, right? Because of the way that you see it. So we appreciate that. Sheila, do you have a specific locale or would you add something in addition to what Dr. Ahmed has indicated for that question?
I would just say that I really strongly agree with Dr. Ahmed, and except I would say that some cities are a little ahead of us in the sense that Denver has some interesting co-created tiny home neighborhoods. Austin has something that's similar, but again, it's not about the project. It's about giving people resources to take care of themselves. And so, to your point, Dr. Ahmed, it doesn't really matter what the project is. It's that the community created it. I do want to share something I forgot to put in my presentation, but it was very informative and constructive for my thinking. And it's a movie. It's on Amazon. It's called Herself, and I appreciate it because it's easier to look at things when they don't happen here because we can look at it more objectively. I have an Irish heritage, so it's set in Ireland. And the long and the short of it is a woman needs housing. A woman is on public assistance. She looks at what public assistance is what she costs public assistance. She says to public assistance, why don't you give me X amount of money and I'm going to go create a house on my own. And they say, no, we can't do that. And so the movie, it's a movie, proceeds to show how the community came together to assist her in doing what she knew was right for herself. And I'm so that confirms what I intuitively and spiritually know we need to move towards. So yeah, some cities are a little bit ahead of us, but I really hope that we don't sit here and think all we need is a perfect project. All we need is to give people opportunity to co-create. No, we need to redistribute resources so people can take care of themselves.
Thank you, Sheila. The next question is from the community: is there a sense of how many people experiencing homelessness in Minneapolis are generationally homeless versus newly or recently become homeless in this generation?
I don't have that data. I just know that the population of people, our neighbors experiencing homelessness, is reflective of our disparities, and that is very likely to be generational.
Yeah, I would echo Sheila as well. I know I started out with a story about a young person whose parent had also been homeless. So we hear the stories. We don't keep data on it. And I think primarily because the system loses track, because we count head of households, for example. And so we lose track when that person is not in that person's household, the connection and the connectedness of that generational experience. I did want to also add to Sheila that hopefully we can exchange information. We did a tiny house project some years ago, and there was no funding, to continue it here. So we've talked about what would it look like for emergency shelter to have that. And it was youth actually built the house, and specifically in the LGBTQIA community. But we have done that, but there was no funding behind it, just to put that out there. And it was a beautiful little house. So.
Well, to pick up on that idea, that thread in terms of funding, the next community member's question is, can I ask your ideas on how to provide accessible funding to oppressed communities that do not have the ability or perhaps knowledge or skills to compete within an RFP process, so to compete within a competitive grant process? So Sheila, we'll come back to you, and then we'll come back to Dr. Ahmed.
Okay. Well, one thing I was really impressed by is the Minneapolis Foundation this year had a specific grant that was led by a person I know well. I've known his 16 years old, and he has direct lived experience of growing up in shelters. And he said, hey, you guys, the people that I know out in my community that are doing great work, they don't want to write a grant. They might be able to, they just don't want to. They want to create a video. And so the Minneapolis Foundation allowed for that option. That was great. Again, I really think that we should stop screening people in general. I think if people need resources, we're a very wealthy state, and we should start figuring out a way to just give it to them. I know that sounds naive, but I'm not saying this out of naivete. I'm saying this out of being very involved in very complex projects that ask a lot of hoops to be jumped through, and you don't necessarily get a better product. It's better to get the resources as fast as you can into people's hands.
Thank you, Sheila. Dr. Ahmed, would you add anything to that particular question?
No, I would echo what Sheila said. I think the only thing I would add is for those of us who know about opportunities and the opportunities are not calling for larger organizations to be the fiscal holder, that we connect people to the resources. I don't think as a community we talk about money very much. And we say to individuals that we know are out there who are trying to create this change, hey, did you know about ABC? Because it's always believed that the larger organization has to be the fiscal holder or has to be the ones who go after these grants. So I think really spreading the word when we hear about resources and access to money that any individual can go after is one way. I also think continuing to do some education around how, as a community, we might build wealth or wealth build will be really important to helping people get access to funds. One resource I can name, I don't know if anyone on this Zoom call has ever read the book Decolonizing Wealth. I think that's really one good book that talks about other strategies of how communities of color can access and start to change or do a paradigm shift around who has access to wealth and why it's been historically the way it's been. So I think we need to relearn how we're supposed to access these resources and access wealth. But from one way I've experienced it or tried to change that is to really let people know when I hear about things that I'm like, did you know? Smaller BIPOC ran organizations, individuals who I know who want to get into nonprofit business, who want to create programming in their own communities, just sharing kind of what you hear.
Thank you. So the next question is, are there any specific examples of grassroots efforts happening at the neighborhood or block to block level to support each other? How have neighborhood efforts in Powderhorn evolved since last summer? The back half of that question might be for me, but the short answer to that is that I don't have a number. We are not aware of the specific number of how many efforts have evolved specifically in Powderhorn. We certainly are aware of 3 that arose from residents occupying the park. But then I'll repeat the first part of that question. So are there any other examples, grassroots effort happening in neighborhoods or at a block to block level to support each other? And when we say support each other, I think it's related to how they can support the overall homelessness crisis.
I would just add, I'm aware and I work closely and appreciate them very much. The Neighbors for Homes efforts, that's a nascent effort in Powderhorn that's trying to perpetuate the good energy that came up to respond to the crisis in the encampments. That was positive. And also there's just an awful lot of mutual aid and grassroots community care work going on that I think is incredibly powerful. And people, I feel I have a bit of an edge when I hear people disparage it because like me and like anyone else, it's not perfect, but I think that collaboration and working through things together works best. And there's a lot of mutual aid going on in this area.
Thank you, Sheila. Dr. Ahmed, anything that you would add to that?
I don't think so, because without trying to sit here and list and think about the folks I know who are on the ground, other than I would echo Sheila, there are many folks out there who are trying to get something going and who are trying to lead grassroots kind of approaches, but none off the top of my head that I would just kind of name drop and say, these are the folks. I can try to come back to that or send some thoughts, resources later around folks I know, because I do get to talk to folks all the time in community who talk about what they're doing, even down to gardening and creating food stability. So there's so much happening all over the place, and the Twin Cities is small, but it's very large at the same time because it's happening all over the place. So I would have to put some more thought into isolating those folks, but yeah.
Well, and the one plug that I would put out there for at least the Powderhorn community is that we will be attempting to communicate more broadly our interest in hearing from residents who are already connected to one another, who are already leading a specific body of work, or they share an interest in terms of what they're organizing themselves around, so that we can understand what your priorities are in the community a little bit more. And at that point, we would then have more visibility to some of the work that's happening on a block-to-block basis, perhaps, which we then would certainly want to be able to share and to highlight and to encourage people to also to get connected to and or to develop their own group or initiate their own group where they're working alongside other residents and neighbors against a shared area of concern, which could also be mutual aid efforts to support persons experiencing homelessness. The next question is, can the panelists speak more to how homophobia, transphobia impacts the experience of homelessness for queer people? And Dr. Ahmed, maybe you may have just more thoughts on that given your work with Avenues. Yes, Dr. Ahmed. Sorry.
So I think in my experience, I'll speak from that Avenues lens. One of the things that we see is that, and at Avenues, we talk a lot about intersectionality, and which is why earlier I alluded to, really to address the experience of homelessness, one has to look at many avenues of why, the experience of homelessness exists. And one of the things that we've seen is that when you add our transphobia, our homophobia in this country, and then you add our kind of racism, poverty, and all these things, it then compounds the experience of folks who kind of belong to all of these kind of communities. So from my experience at Avenues and in my work, what I see is that because that happens, we often count brown or Black bodies as saying they have a disproportionate level or a higher level of experiencing homelessness. But what it really comes down to is then you add the transphobia, the homophobia, and then we up those numbers exponentially, right? Then those folks have an even higher level of experiencing homelessness because of. So I think, you know, what we know is that, again, when one phobia exists, it exacerbates the rest of them. And so it's the key reason why I said earlier, we have to look at all of these areas to really address this issue. We cannot look at one area and say, I'm going to work on the experience of homelessness, because then you leave out the fact that trans and homophobia play a part, leave out the fact that the racism plays a part, the poverty plays a part, gender plays a part. And we forget to really bring meaning and connection, that there is an intersectionality of all of these things, that individuals who experience homelessness belong to multiple of these groups. So I think from, you know, my experience, what we do, at least from that standpoint, is really say that when we're talking about and lobbying and trying to create change around the experience of homelessness, we have to do that same work around social justice, around transphobia, around homophobia, around gender, around class. We have to really do the work around all of these issues, because we will not create change in the area of homelessness until we create change and why that homelessness is happening. And those are core areas as to why we see higher levels of these groups experiencing homelessness.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Sheila, anything that you would add to that particular question? Okay.
Hey, Tabitha, I just wanted to chime in a little bit. My name is Tyra, and I am one of the original members of Street Voices of Change. And I'm also born and raised in South Minneapolis. Powderhorn Park is where I grew up. And what went on last summer, to walk through that place, I just want to give some background, to see my friends. Some were family. That, you know, people I grew up with, to be in that space, it was like really heart-wrenching. And lots of folks, I do want to give a shout out to the neighbors that did turn out, because there was some positive responses from community who wanted to engage. And so I'm so glad to be part of this particular conversation. I did have a response about RFP, but I was running around the house trying to come back to this to this screen. But right now we're on the topic of the discriminations against dealing with homophobia, and it is a real thing in shelters. And then if you're Black, oh my gosh, you know, it just the double whammy there. We at Street Voices of Change have been working on Shelter Residents Bill of Rights that is now at the Capitol and is going to get jacketed. And we're going to have a real conversation on how shelters have been discriminative against people of color, and then also our transgender folks and the homophobia that happens at shelters. Abuses along race and sexual orientation, gender, religion, and other protective classes have been common by both staff and residents. And even more recent, I think it was before COVID, our head at the HUD actually took the protection for folks in shelters away, saying that I think the attitude was, well, they're already protected under a line of discrimination rights, but not naming them specifically. And so I'll be so happy when we get that we have this inauguration that's happening right now, so we get back to that and naming it and owning it. And that's what's really it's about, on how we can start digging us out of this abyss of racial disparity in my hometown. And so just wanted to note that, and I appreciate that you're having this conversation, because Powderhorn Park is man, it brings me to tears, some of the memories that I had there. I had mental health issues as a child walking through that park and didn't even know it until I was 40-ish. You know, so the racial disparities for Black and brown bodies, Indigenous people, on how we got to that place is um, all of our faults is what I want to say. So I appreciate that we're here having this conversation and we get to own it.
Tyra, you said your name is Tyra, correct?
Yes.
Listen, man, if I could do a cartwheel, I would. I just want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for coming off the screen. To the best of our ability in these last seconds, just know that I believe that everybody on this call is trying to hold as much as you shared, because you did not have to. If you would please be so kind as to put your contact information into the chat so we can follow up with you about the work that Street Voices of Change is doing to see if we as an organization can help amplify what's in that bill. I appreciate you. I appreciate everyone for coming out tonight to not only hear from you unexpectedly, which was a gift, but certainly hear from our panelists. And so with that, I would like to thank Sheila, Delaney, and Dr. Zayed Ahmed for helping guide us through sometimes what maybe might call a challenging conversation, but to borrow a word from 2020, an essential conversation. I also want to acknowledge and thank every community member who showed up and showed out and attempted to, in the best of their ability, to walk alongside our community members who were unhoused this past summer. Not easy work. And certainly there's a lot of things that we are still learning, so that we are in a better position and better prepared to support from a place of allyship persons for whom housing instability or homelessness is a reality. Folks, it is 7:01. You have our eternal gratitude over at Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association. On behalf of the staff and the entire board, we appreciate you. We see you. Thank you for coming out. And we will continue these conversations into the coming year. Have an amazing evening.